Sup, everyone, Wafer here. Today we got this one right here, the rise and fall of a game that meant nothing. Let's rate it.
When it comes to checking out new and upcoming titles, I have a really unscientific approach to the whole thing. Namely,
How?
I just stumble into them. Such is the case with this game back in 2021. Now, Outriders flew under many gamers' radar back in early 2019 when they went
I've heard massive things about it when it came out, but before that, never.
Public with an announcement trailer, which I missed. A year later, People Can Fly, the studio behind Outriders, dropped another official reveal trailer. Again, I missed it. What followed was a steady volley of edgy media splashes leading into early 2021, of which I saw none of them. It was by sheer dumb luck I stumbled into Outriders a week before their playable demo went live in February of that same year. And what followed was a game that experienced tremendous early success, followed by an equally rapid and impressive crash back to obscurity.
Yeah, it was that game with the cover system, which felt like a mix between Gears of War and Destiny, perhaps? Something like that. But it got worse when you went further with it. Like, the endgame was, like, absolutely horrendous, from what I've heard.
System of failure.
But yeah.
This is LtBuzzLitebeer, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're taking a look back at Outriders, a title that poised itself as an option to the standard online shooter. You see, PCF pushed concepts like a weighty campaign that deserved your time, compelling storylines, build crafting that mattered right out of the box, and an endgame that was accessible on launch day, and they delivered all of this in spades, featuring some of the most ambitious build crafting imaginable with perks.
Ambitious. Like in every failed project, and after that when documentary or video like this was made, the word ambitious felt so often. It's insane. Like this word like literally destroys so many games. It's insane.
Talents.
Because I try to do too much. Like, bro, shit. Try the simple things first and then work from there.
Class system that pushed you and your biological sledgehammer to the point of player power fantasy overload. PCF found that sweet spot ratio for compelling combat loops, and they hammered that concept all the way to the last second of the game. Outriders wasn't a game that relied on in-game or hundreds of hours of grind time to find the fun. It nailed that minute one. Listening to this testimonial, one would wonder where Outriders went so wrong. What did it do to contribute to its own death? Well, outside of that compelling combat and gameplay loop, pretty much everything. Here, let me just check back over my notes.
Yep.
No, that's right. Everything. Outriders was a perfect example of what happens when all the complexities of a game outside of the game itself simply overwhelm a studio. To fully appreciate just how big Outriders was at launch, all one needs to do is take a look at the initial player counts on Steam, hitting an all-time peak of over 125,000 concurrent players.
This is the proof that this game had a good shot, but yeah, it clearly missed it.
And of course, this does not include things like Epic Store, Xbox Game Pass, which Outriders was available to play on day one, and of course, PlayStation. Now, just to give you a point of reference, here's Resident Evil Village at 106,000. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, even when supercharged by the Netflix series, at 103,000 players. More recently, Warhammer 40k Darktide at 107,000. And according to Statista, the number 5 top-selling video game by dollar sales in the United States for 2021, Battlefield 2042. At just 100,000 players. Now, Steam charts won't give us the full picture, different platforms or launchers, but it is a method of recording
it's somewhat accurate, but the numbers are not like exactly the same.
How players are interacting with a game, and out of the box, Outriders was able to outperform notable and storied franchises. You can probably guess where this one's heading, though. Studio known for smaller titles such as Painkiller, Bulletstorm, and more recently, chapters for Gears of War and Fortnite, crashes into technical nightmare with overnight gaming success. Outriders was plagued with technical gremlins the minute it went live, if you were actually able to log on. Server disconnects, server offline for maintenance, and other incredibly janky infrastructure issues were the norm, not just for the first few weeks of the game's launch, but for the lifetime of this game. Things went from bad to worse when login bugs started popping up, trapping players in perpetual loading screens, and eventually leading to full inventory wipes. Now, some of these were corrected, but just imagine grinding for 50, 75, 100 hours only to have your entire inventory of weapons and gear erased. Matchmaking was also
I would immediately uninstall, man. This is unacceptable.
Point of contention, as PCF had actually elected to utilize peer-to-peer connections and cross-platform. Players reported frequent disconnects from parties, massive lag spikes, and items like player abilities simply not working while in party. The dichotomy within Outriders could not be more evident. Intoxicating, visceral combat loop versus one of the worst technical performing games on record. Even today, when asked, players applaud this game's mechanics and combat, but refuse to revisit the game based on the nightmarish technical flaws. Throughout this game's history, PCF attempted to wrestle the game back into a state of functionality, often making odd choices, both in terms of scope of changes and timelines. Just weeks after the game's initial release, and still in the throngs of technical hell, PCF announced huge balance changes were incoming, effectively nerfing many of the class nodes and abilities. Odd timing, considering the circumstances, and completely counter to the studio's loud profession that Outriders was not a live service game. Now, it may not have been, but there were certainly strong indications that the game, at some point in development, was actually trending in that direction. Within weeks of the game's initial April 1st launch, players had actually reached the end-game content and were busy grinding out and perfecting builds. Expeditions, essentially mini dungeon grinds that used unique settings, were never designed to keep players fully engaged, and much like the final portions of the campaign, they felt hurried and incomplete. But through it all, the game's balls-to-the-wall combat system and build crafting continue to keep players interested. Now, in an attempt to further rein in the game's myriad of technical issues and balance flaws, People Can Fly announced the New Horizon update in mid-November 2021. Framed as a promise by the studio to correct the previous wrongs, New Horizon was packed full of bug fixes.
It's with every single game which comes out, some holy patch will come out which will save the game. For sure, man.
Technical patches and 4 new expeditions in a refreshing, more lethal style. The game did perform better, and the new expeditions, some incorporating secret encounters and mechanics, were well received. And then, on the heels of the New Horizon update, the comms team, managed by Square Enix, just went dark. In fact, if asked, many fans of the Outriders franchise will point out the irregular contact between the comms team and the player base as a major issue within this game. There were frequent and long periods of no news, questions going unanswered, and just general feelings of being ignored. This was further exacerbated by studio devs routing any questions or direction through their intermediaries at Square Enix, who then distributed those to the player base. This method lengthened response times and further added fuel to the flames, as players were trying to enjoy the product but were fighting a war on 2 fronts. Little to no information, and a game with continued technical gremlins. As expected, players began leaving the game in droves. By March 2022, just under a year after launch, Outriders, a game with so much potential and initial player counts in excess of 125,000 players on Steam, was just able to cross the 1,300 player mark. People Can Fly attempted a comeback in July 2022 with the introduction of their first for-purchase DLC.
I think if it's somewhat above 1K, it's pretty lively. Like, you will always find a game, but if it goes below that, man, like, and the moments where you need to, like, for a really long ass time to find a group, I would consider that game dead. Like, I would give up on that.
World Slayer. Clocking in at roughly $40 USD, World Slayer introduced new weapons, abilities, progression systems, story missions, lore, and a new in-game activity, the Trials of Tarja Gratar. Now, for fans of the franchise, it was widely seen as more of what had initially attracted players to the game. The combat was still fast-paced, violent, and laced with powerful abilities, the loot was still varied and plentiful, and the game was introduced to another protagonist that needed terminating. On paper, World Slayer looked like it had all the right ingredients to be a tremendous success for the franchise, but once again, many of the same design flaws and issues with the base game resurfaced, but now armed with new and even more powerful deficiencies, and all at a $40 price tag. The campaign and story missions were now entirely too short. The protagonist encounters were scarce and predictable, and the gear game, which was once a cornerstone of the base game, had been completely destroyed. Apocalypse tier gear was now the highest tier of loot, eclipsing older builds and requiring all new gear to be sourced. Now, since APOC gear could not be crafted or have its rarity improved, it took a once vibrant and interesting build crafting element and turned it static. Players quickly realized that mods, which were in the past free to appear on whatever gear pieces they wanted, were now locked and tied to specific gear slots. World Slayer, in an attempt to up the gear game, had effectively killed it overnight, leading many players to equip and use only legendary pieces, as the mods and attributes were predictable. It was soon discovered that hackers were given free reign with this new DLC, as PCF, in an attempt to stabilize the matchmaking connections, had
like if I was a veteran of this game, like, and would have given it a chance, like, every single time they tried to do something new, this would be the point where I would truly quit. Like, I stick to some of those games which were, like, pretty garbage, but I was so invested in them that I just couldn't quit. But when something like this arises, this, like, game breaking that I would never support like this anymore.
Disabled and removed the easy anti-cheat protections. Offending players could immediately affect change, positive or negative, to other players in the party without their consent. The new in-game content, the Trials of Tarja Gratar, was initially interesting but soon became boorish, as it was never given the mechanic to adapt, as in becoming procedurally generated. Of course, this led to players farming specific boss encounters for XP and loot, which in turn led to PCF nerfing said boss encounters, XP, and loot, and it was received as you might expect. Add in an overly oppressive endgame APOC tier grind, one that was universally called for to have it become more generous but was ignored by the studio, and within a month of World Slayer's release, player counts had again fallen tragically back to pre-World Slayer counts. Current Steam player counts are sub 1,000 players, and even though the game is still technically here, it is all but dead. In retrospect, the Outriders concept, that crazy and tightly packed combat loop, loot, and initially limitless build crafting, and for a looter, a somewhat engaging storyline, all led to what should have been a tremendous success. Players were calling Outriders third-person Destiny, but with limitless super abilities. Each class was unique and brought a completely different playstyle to the battlefield. Point being, even with all of this going for it, Outriders was constantly dragging an equally powerful anchor of extremely poor technical performance and catastrophic design choices that were more than enough to overpower its positives. Coupled with infrequent community engagement, balance changes that reduced the overall fun factor, and an in-game that wasn't entirely perfected, and it was only a matter of time before Outriders and People Can Fly were crushed under the weight of their own creation. I, of course, welcome your feedback on anything Outriders. Make sure to leave me a comment.
This was insanely sad. Damn. Like, I can remember when this game came out, like, it was hype for, like, 1 week, and after that it immediately died off. Like, it's insane. But that's the fate of many games. Like, what can you do? It is what it is. I really enjoyed my time with Outriders, which dropped in the middle of a pandemic. Oh, okay, but it's also like a big boost to your numbers. When I was desperate for something new to play, that being said, the replayability and the endgame was paper thin. Exactly. You can only run the same mission so many times, so Division 2 to a lesser extent has the same issue. Damn. Holy shit. I guess it is, man. I guess that's it, man. Like, I would really appreciate if you would support me, and this dude, he like made the content. I just reacted to it. And yeah, support us both, but it would be insane. Like, I would really appreciate something like a comment, you know? The typical stuff, a sub would be much appreciated. And that's it. I guess see you next time. Wafer.